Hi, this is Pastor John, and you are listening to or watching Dig Deeper, which is a weekly Bible study resource that we put out from Journey of Life Lutheran Church in Orlando, Florida. The point of Dig Deeper is to dig more deeply into whatever the topic of the sermon is on Sunday, because the sermon is not like the last word on things. It's the beginning of the conversation. I'm hoping that the scriptures become something we chew on all week long, and that we really sort of let them speak to our lives and our souls. So we do Dig Deeper, which people can listen to during the middle of the week or use in small groups, which you'll see there's small group questions in the middle here. But now we're beginning a new series on Psalm 23, and this series is actually going to take us all the way through Lent, which will end in Holy Week. And so that's several weeks away. And what we're going to do is look through Psalm 23 very slowly. This is more of a crock pot than a microwave. But we're going to look through Psalm 23 very slowly. Psalm 23 is the famous psalm that begins, "The Lord is my shepherd." And so that's what we're doing here. Because we want to, as we move into Lent, we want to honor the calendar of the church. The church calendar is there to sort of add a rhythm to our spiritual life. Of course, each of our lives has sort of its own rhythm as well. We all have our more contemplative times and more celebrative times. But the church year also offers us a rhythm, a chance to move through different seasons and just sort of let different concentrations or emphases wash over us. And when we're in Lent is a contemplative season. It's a season for listening, I would say. And as we move through Psalm 23, we're going to meditate on it together. And in fact, there will also be, if you're coming to church on Sundays, you can pick up a meditation CD on Psalm 23 that has some meditations in different styles and different lengths on Psalm 23 with some background music and stuff to help people practice this ancient art or discipline, however you want to say it, of meditation. And you'll hear more about this if you want to go listen to the recording from Sunday, March 9th, because we're going to talk quite a bit about it. But the idea is that we're meditating on Psalm 23, and as we do that, we bring that word, all those words, into our lives and let that integrate into us and into the way we think, and that transforms our life. And so Lent is our sort of contemplative season for listening here, and we're beginning now. And before we start, though, the opening question for this episode of Dig Deeper is, what is your favorite farm animal? What's your favorite farm animal? So pause here if you're in a small group, and take a moment to share with each other about what your favorite farm animal is. Okay, so we're going to move on, and this whole series is on Psalm 23. And today we're just going to look at Psalm 23 verse 1 in some depth anyways. And of course, I can't really read the text to you because it's only one verse. So each week I'm going to read Psalm 23 to you, and I just listen to it and let it kind of wash over you as we begin. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Okay, part one. In part one, we're this verse, Psalm 23, basically has two phrases, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So in part one, we're going to sort of tear into the Lord is my shepherd, and in part 2, we will tear into I shall not want. So, here we go. Part 1, the Lord is my shepherd. The first word here is the Lord, and if you are reading along, or if you're watching, you will notice that the word Lord in your Bible is either in all caps or it's in what's called small caps, where the letters that would be lowercase are uppercase letters, but they're printed as small as lowercase letters. But in either case, the word is all caps or small caps. And what that indicates is that the Hebrew word underneath the word Lord there is Yahweh. See, there's two words here in the Old Testament, basically, two words that are both translated as Lord. And one is Adonai, which is Lord like anybody who's over you. You know, the way we hear my Lord used in Old English stuff all the time, right? What does my Lord desire of me? That kind of thing, or whatever. Whatever your lordship wants, right? That kind of thing. That's not what's underneath in Hebrew in the word Lord when you see these the word Lord printed in all caps or in small caps. Underneath there in Hebrew is the word Yahweh. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can see Yahweh written in Hebrew there. And Hebrew reads right to left, not left to right. And that's actually called the tetragrammaton. The tetragrammaton, which tetragrammaton just means 4 letters in Greek. So this is the 4-letter thing. But Yahweh is such an important word. It's what God calls himself, that we have a name for the word. It's the tetragrammaton. So that's Yahweh. And as we read through the Old Testament, a couple things. First of all, the word Yahweh appears to be related to the word Hawa, which is basically the verb to be. So Yahweh has traditionally been thought of a reference to God's existence in and of himself. You and I, we all, our existence depends on God. We are because he wants us to be. Yahweh himself is simply the one who is, he who is. And so that's the meaning that has been taken from the idea that Yahweh is built on the word Hawa, which is the verb to be. So Yahweh, he who is. Now this word Yahweh appears a lot, as you'll see in the Old Testament. And even though it is certainly the word that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai, when Moses said, "Who shall I tell them sent me?" And he said, "Tell them Yahweh sent you. The one who is sent you." As we look back through, we find Yahweh used for God to denote God. Much earlier in the Old Testament, it wasn't revealed for the first time at the burning bush. Although, since Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, he might have thought backwards and said Yahweh said when Yahweh's name wasn't given yet. And that's kind of a scholarly issue, and I don't think that really bears on our life too much. But anyway, so we find Yahweh, and you'll see this all over the place, the Lord in small caps, but it's actually in more places than you would think, because the shortened form for Yahweh is Yah. And we see Yah blended in to many other names. In fact, you could probably think of some right now. Jeremiah, Yah. Isaiah, Yah. Joshua, or Yeshua is how it's pronounced in Hebrew. In fact, there's 10 Hebrew leaders with Yah built into their name. And Joshua means Yahweh is salvation. And Joshua, Yeshua, is actually the Hebrew name for someone who you are probably familiar with. His name is Jesus. Yes, that's right. So Yeshua is the Hebrew way to say the word Jesus, and it means God is salvation. So there's Yahweh, and that's who we're talking about, the one who is Yahweh, the one who is on in and of himself. This is the one who is our shepherd. That's word one. Now we'll move on to word two, is. And now, it's not was and it's not will be. It's is. And it's even more is than it might appear. And let me explain what I mean by that. In some languages, if something exists in that state, you don't even have to put the verb in. It's just understood. If there's no verb, then you understand the thing to exist in that way, right? And so if we look underneath here, we of course have to say the Lord is my shepherd. But if you go into Hebrew, the verb is actually missing altogether. It's the Lord, my shepherd. And what he means is it just is. This is the way it is. It's not just was. David is the one who wrote this psalm, and he certainly had different times where things seemed to be going well and things seemed to be going poorly for him. But either way, as he writes this psalm, it's not just that the Lord was his shepherd. He has acted as his shepherd from time to time. It's that he is right now. The way the relationship simply is. This is the way it is. It's not a reference to the past tense, nor is it a reference to the future tense. It's not, I should say, the future tense exclusively or the past tense exclusively. It covers all that because this is the state of things. The Lord exists as my shepherd. It's not just looking forward and it's not just looking back. Is. And we don't need to spend too much time there since, as I said, that verb isn't actually even in the Hebrew text. So, next, my. The Lord is my shepherd. Now, there's kind of two senses in which we could talk about this word my. One is that when we talk about my God or whatever, it's, God is God. God is the creator. God is the Lord of the universe, regardless of what we think. So in one sense, when we address God, even as a shepherd, the one who shepherds the world, who brought it into being and takes care of it, it's kind of a unilateral thing. It doesn't really matter what we think about it. It just is. But that's clearly not the way David is thinking here. David's thinking more in this reciprocal kind of sense where he not only understands that God, the Lord, is his shepherd, that Yahweh is his shepherd, but he celebrates in it. He's glad and exults in the idea that Yahweh is his shepherd. And there's a humility there, right? Because there's an awful lot of people that would not want to acknowledge any shepherd. They are their own shepherd, right? But David doesn't say that. He doesn't say, I am my own shepherd. He says, the Lord is my shepherd. And, he's celebrating that his shepherd is the one who is. While other people in other nations would say that, Molech is my shepherd or whatever like that. I'm not even sure if they would talk that way, but they might, because the idea of the king or the God being the shepherd, I don't think that's unique to the kingdom of Israel. But David's saying, look, you can have all your little shepherds you want. The Lord, he who is my shepherd. Everyone is under some shepherd. David is glad to belong to Yahweh's flock. He is my shepherd. Not only is he my shepherd because he is the king of the universe, but he's my shepherd because he has taken me into his fold, and I am glad to be there, and I don't run away from it. I nestle up to it. I don't rebel against Yahweh's being my shepherd. I am pleased by Yahweh being my shepherd. I move toward that, and I'm glad of that. So there's a lot buried in this little word of my shepherd there. So the Lord is my, and the last one is shepherd. Now, shepherds come in every level of commitment to their sheep, from the wandering daily laborer who's hired to watch the sheep and might even be able to be hired away by a better offer from someone who happens to walk along the trail while he's tending sheep. But it goes all the way to the family that owns the sheep, and I've read several stories about shepherd families where the sheep, obviously they need to be sheared and eventually they get slaughtered, but they're kind of seen like part of the family to these shepherds. And the shepherds all know their sheep when it gets to this level. They know the sheep by name, by look. They know the sheep by temperament. And I even read a story of one. This is a modern day shepherd in somewhere over in the Middle East, and he had decided to will his flock to his second son. And the guy who was interviewing him said, "Why is that?" And he said, "It's because my older son doesn't love the sheep." And he loved his sheep. And so he wanted to make sure they got taken care of. Good shepherds know their sheep. Good shepherds love their sheep. To you and me, they all look exactly the same, right? I mean, I can't tell one sheep from another, but the shepherd recognizes his sheep. And in fact, the sheep recognize the shepherd too. They know the voice of their shepherd. From what I've heard, if you have flocks mixed together, like they're all grazing, one shepherd can call out for his sheep as he needs to lead them away for the night or whatever, and his sheep will, begin to filter out and make their way over and follow him. They know his voice, and they follow it. And the following kind of is interesting too. It says I heard a story of a guy who is on tour in Israel, and they had been talking about sheep and how the sheep know the shepherd's voice, and they follow the shepherd, and he can call them, and they'll just follow him across. And the bus is driving along, and they saw a little herd of sheep, and there was a guy walking behind them, sort of pushing them along. And so the tourist questioned the tour guide and said, I thought you said the shepherds lead from the front and the sheep know them and they just follow his voice. What's going on there? And the tour guide, said, well, that guy's not the shepherd. He's the butcher. So the shepherds lead from the front because the good shepherds, love their sheep. And I've been reading up on this a little, and evidently you can tell quite a bit. You can tell about the shepherd, at least about the shepherd's feeling for the sheep, by the conditions of his sheep and by the condition of the pastures in which the sheep are kept. I was reading this book called A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23, and it's written, of course, by a shepherd, and he talks about how you can just sort of see the difference from different people's pastures, and evidently the guy who was in the pasture next to him really didn't care about his sheep. The sheep had, open sores, and the land wasn't taken care of, so it was very scrubby, and the sheep didn't eat well, and they were kind of thin, and he said quite often he would look up, and the sheep would be at the fence of this other guy's pasture, looking longingly over at his pasture because he loved his sheep, and he took care of the pasture so the sheep were well cared for and had plenty of good grass to eat. And so we when we think of the Lord as our shepherd, we of course assume that we mean he's a good and loving shepherd. That would be part of the assumption. You wouldn't, even though there are bad shepherds and good shepherds, we wouldn't say the Lord is our shepherd and, oh, he's an awful shepherd. That's just, why would you even bother saying he's a shepherd if he's a bad shepherd, right? No, he's a good shepherd. He's a loving shepherd. He's the shepherd who stays with his sheep. And this metaphor that is, familiar and unfamiliar to us. It's familiar because it's used, but it's unfamiliar to many of us like me who were raised in the suburbs and have spent basically all my life either in cities or in the suburbs. But it's not really used very much early in the scriptures. David is kind of the first one to really start to employ this. But as we go through the scriptures, once they have this metaphor of God as our shepherd has been established by David, then we begin to see it appearing all over the place. And you can, if you're watching, you can see some of the Bible passages where shepherd occurs. Isaiah 40, verse 11. Let me read that one to you. Isaiah 40, verse 11 says, "He will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with young." And so there, of course, we have the tender care of the loving shepherd. Isaiah 49 talks about it. Jeremiah talks about God as our shepherd. I'll read to you Jeremiah 31, verse 10. "Hear the word of the Lord, O nations. Declare it in the coastlands far away. He who scattered Israel will gather him. He and will keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock." So again, the assumption of calling God our shepherd and using that metaphor is that he's a good and kind and loving shepherd. And if we keep going through the Bible, we'll find the shepherd metaphor in many places, including Ezekiel and John and Hebrews and 1 Peter and Revelation. So that carries through, kind of begins with David, but carries through the scriptures from there on. Evidently, the idea of the Lord as our shepherd must have really resonated with the souls of people and the way they perceive their relationship with God, because it seems to have really taken hold, this metaphor of God as our shepherd. So that's part one, and here's the discussion question. And it's sort of a generalized discussion question, because we're going to be, like I said, we're going to be spending several weeks together on Psalm 23, so we can ask some general questions too. Here's the question for part one. Pick a phrase in Psalm 23 that you find very meaningful, and share why it is meaningful to you. Part 2, the next phrase. We did "The Lord is my shepherd," and now we are on "I shall not want." When we look at this phrase, it kind of stands out in a way because it says "I." And many of the Psalms, well, the Psalms were written, many of them were written for, or at least used for, worship purposes. And worship, things written for community worship, and I don't mean community just like little community. I mean as in communal as opposed to solo, like sitting down to pray by yourself. I mean worship in community with other, in the Old Testament, of course, it would be with other Jews. And in the New Testament, for us, it would be with other Christians. Often the word "we" is used there. You know, you speak in the first person plural. But Psalm 23 is in the singular. And so Psalm 23 really kind of highlights the individual aspect of our faith as opposed to the community. And our faith certainly has both individual and community aspects. For instance, when Jesus taught about prayer, the disciples said, "Teach us to pray." And you remember what he said, right? It's in several places. Matthew 6, verse 9 is one. Jesus said, "Pray then like this: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." And so in that instance, our Father, that is obviously in the first person plural. It's all of us together. It's not me. And different periods of time in history tend to emphasize more the individual aspect of our faith, and different periods of time tend to aspect the community or the communal aspect of our faith. And it's just something to point out that Psalm 23 kind of comes from that personal perspective. This is about a person's relationship to Yahweh. And it's not that we can't all say it together, because obviously Yahweh desires this same relationship with all of us, but this is about me and the Father, which is fine as long as we recognize that balance, or it's not even a balance at like an either or, it's It's a both and. There is this community aspect and this individual aspect to our faith. And when we emphasize one over and above the other, and we lose the other, our faith life and our Christian life is much poorer for it. So, I shall not want. We're going to go with want right here, and we'll get to the not in a minute, but we're going to take some time to think about wanting. Now, I shall not want. This is actually a little bit of a throwback, I think, to older English, and I think the word want has remained in Psalm 23 because it's one of these. The whole thing is obviously sacred text, but Psalm 23 is one of those sacred texts, right? It's like the Lord's Prayer. It just, boy, you change one thing out of that, and it doesn't matter what you do, you're in trouble. So, want, we use the word want in modern English, but typically when we think of want, we think of desire. And that's not really what's going on here. It has more to do with need than this sort of desire. It has more to do with lack. Lack would be a better word. I shall not lack, because when you get underneath there's not really. It doesn't have to do with, as I said, this sort of emotional, psychological experience of wanting things. So I want a new car. Oh, I want a bigger house. Or in my son's case, oh, I want a house that has stairs, or something like that. It doesn't have to do with that feeling of want. The word underneath want here is like wanting. He was found wanting, or whatever like that. Lacking, not measuring up, that kind of thing. It has more to do with lack. And so really, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not lack. Or is a better translation, but I think because want still works, even though it can be a little confusing, I think the translators just stuck with it. Otherwise, they'd have to come home to their spouses and explain themselves. You did what? No, it's I shall not want. That's the word. Sorry. Oh, let me get back to where I was going here. I shall not want. Right, okay. So if we look to other translations, I use the English Standard Version. I like it. It's a fairly straightforward translation. They've tried to do a good job of using English words to catch things and meanings, but they have also some versions really go further down the scale. There's the one-to-one translation where you try to have one English word for one word from the Greek or the Hebrew, and that can get very wooden and hard to understand. And then you kind of get a little bit of leeway with that, and that's still a translation. But the further along that scale you move, you get all the way to where you read a sentence and then you kind of try to rephrase the sentence in your own words, and that's more like a paraphrase at that point. And if we look at several different Bible translations, we'll see how different versions tried to deal with this idea of want. And no, I don't know any stories about translators going home to their spouses and getting in trouble. Oh, man. Okay, so anyway, back to it. Looking through some other translations, the New King James Version, which is a version I also really like because it's very similar to the English Standard Version in that they try to stick with the wording as much as they can. But in the New King James, you would find a little tiny letter above the word want with a footnote that says lack. And then if you move further down the scale from translation to paraphrase, the contemporary English version, which tries to be very simple and yet still a translation, says, I will never be in need. So that's pretty close to lack, right? And then you get to the New Living Translation, and they have flipped it around a little bit, and they say, I have all that I need, which I think is reflective of the same truth, right? But it's different. They have rephrased it into a positive. It's not that I will not lack, it's that I have all that I need. And so that's a little different, right? And that's where you start to have to say, well, does that change the meaning? How does that change, especially with poetry, right? I mean, poetry is very reflective sort of thing. And how does that change the meaning for me a little bit if I say I will not, or I will lack nothing, I will not be in want, versus I have all that I need? And then if we go all the way down to the Message, which they still label a translation, but I think I think they're using the word translation pretty loosely at that point. The Message says, "I don't need a thing." In fact, that whole verse, I have to give him credit because he tried. What's his name? Eugene Peterson, the guy who did the Message, tried to stay true to the text because he didn't put the verb "is" in. It just says, "The Lord, my shepherd, I don't need a thing." So but anyway, the idea here is want, and it has to do with our existence as opposed to this cognitive experience of desire, right? That doesn't mean it doesn't affect that. We'll get to that in a minute. But I shall not want. I shall not lack. I shall lack nothing. I will never be in need. I have all that I need. I don't need a thing. So what does it mean to not want anything? What does it mean to lack nothing? I think that's a big question. To say I shall not want, what does that mean? What does that? And to me, that's where this idea of what this word want really means becomes important. Because of course we all have things we desire. Does this mean I desire nothing? Well, that's desiring nothing isn't holy. It's apathy, right? I mean, I don't care. That's meaning I don't care about anything, right? I don't care about anything. You don't want a good marriage? Well, I shall not want. You don't want to see loving community in your church? Well, I shall not want, right? And so that's where this idea of really knowing what they mean by lack, what David means by lack, or by want, meaning more like lack, or a need kind of thing as opposed to a desire kind of thing, really becomes important. So I will lack nothing. But what does that mean then? If you even carry that further, though, is this actual want, actual lacking, or just a perceived lacking of something? Does this mean I will lack nothing, or I will never feel like I am lacking anything? That's quite a bold statement to make. I shall not want. I shall not lack. What would that mean if I never felt lacking? Is this historically observable? Do Christians lack nothing? Do Christians lack anything? If you look across the world, in history, even now, what does this mean? I shall not want. I shall not lack. I shall lack nothing. I will never be in need. See, Psalm 23 is worth contemplating. We'll get to some more in a minute. But let's continue now with the part 2 discussion question, which is, what kind of things are wanting in our culture that are not necessarily wanting in other cultures or countries, would you say? And obviously this is an opinion kind of question, because different people are going to have different ideas about what's wanting or lacking in our culture that's not necessarily wanting or lacking in other cultures or countries. But it's interesting to think about, because our culture affects us, and what we see as wanting in our culture is going to affect perhaps what we see as wanting in our own lives, right? So take a moment to discuss that question if you're in a group. Part 3, Application. Now we get to think a little bit about how to apply this to our lives. The Lord is my shepherd. Now, this is not always obvious or observable. The Lord is my shepherd is a position of faith. If we go back just historically to David's life, we can see times when it would be very difficult to say that, oh, it's very clearly God is shepherding, tending, looking out for David. I don't know if you remember David, after he'd been anointed king, actually King Saul, the king who was, God told him when he was going to lose his throne, King Saul had these evil or bad moods or fits or whatever you want to call them come over him, and one of the things that would quiet him was music, and David was a talented musician, and so Saul actually called for David to come in and play and sing for him, and so David would be in there singing, and sometimes this fit would come over him and he'd hurl a spear at David, and I'm like, really? That's God's shepherding? That's God shepherding David, bringing him into the palace where Saul's trying to hurl a spear and pin him against the wall? So this is, sometimes we see this, and I think we have to acknowledge that sometimes we don't. It's hard to see. It's not something that is apparent on the surface that God is shepherding us. It's a position of faith, and I think we need to openly acknowledge that it is, in fact, a position of faith. We Christians live assuming and trusting that God is shepherding us, that God is faithful to his promises, even though sometimes they don't seem verifiable in any sense where things are going right. And you know, I was listening to a sermon this week, and one of the things the preacher there pointed out in terms of this idea of the Lord is our shepherd is that there are more than a few instances of the people that we sort of regard as saints. You know, in the Lutheran Church, we don't do saints in the way the Catholic Church does. But we still regard there's people who have lived exemplary lives, and people we want to look to and emulate. And as we look at some people's lives, we see different developments in their idea of what it is to be shepherded by the Lord. Mother Teresa struggled. She said, according to this preacher, she said she started doing what she was doing, caring for the poor in Calcutta, because God spoke to her, and then he quit speaking to her, and she felt abandoned in some ways for the rest of her life. Augustine, who wrote The City of God, one of the most influential theologians in the history of the church, later in life just quit writing. And I think he kind of got to the end of his answers and said, well, there's a lot of things that are still mysterious. And who else? St. Francis was the same way. Toward the end of his life, the answers seemed less clear to him. And so I think when we say the Lord is my shepherd, we have what we want is a God who's directing every moment in our lives. And certainly the scriptures do speak in those terms, and we have to take that into account and want to be true to that type of that assertion of the scripture. But we also want to, I guess we want to be honest. We want to be clear with ourselves about the way we're experiencing our life. And if we say the Lord is our shepherd in a way that he's actually like guiding every moment and causing everything to happen from the parking place you get at the mall to whether or not you're on time to pick up your kids, and and all these kind of things. If we're giving, if we go into that level of control when we think of God as our shepherd, then we sort of have to go into the place where God caused the tsunami a while ago that flooded Japan, and God's caused the radiation that's moving through the ocean, and then God is the author of an awful lot of suffering, and then we end up with Ecclesiastes, and why do good people suffer, and we certainly see plenty of instances, not always, but sometimes we see instances where people who are not following God are looking to him as shepherd prosper. They do well. They come out on top. And, as I look at this, the Lord is my shepherd, I'm thinking even off the top of my head, the shepherd is watching out for the sheep, but he doesn't, and he moves them from place to place, right? He tries to move them toward green pastures and waters they can drink out of, but that doesn't mean they're not hungry sometimes. It certainly doesn't mean he's picking up and moving each foot of each sheep or anything like that. And so I'm not sure the shepherding metaphor doesn't really work pretty well for the ambiguities that we face in life. And it's a statement of faith. I am a sheep, and I have to walk, and I'm part of a flock, and I'm going to be moved around, but I got to move my own feet and stuff. But the Lord is my shepherd. He's with me, and he's standing over me. Just because sheep have a shepherd doesn't mean they don't get hurt. It just means there's someone there that cares for them when they get hurt. So I think maybe that might be part of the reason the shepherd metaphor has really taken hold, is because it leaves space for life, but also space for faith and trust. The Lord is my shepherd, and Jesus adopted the shepherd myth for himself. Myth was the wrong word. The shepherd metaphor for himself. We hear him talk to his disciples. I put verse of the day, by the way. Most of the verses we're going to look at are in this handout. It's the handout that goes with the sermon, which is available from our website, www.journeyoflife.org. And so we have a different verse each day of the week for the week following the message that kind of helps give a reflection to the kind of things we're thinking about during the week. And so this one, for instance, is the verse of the day on March 11th. By the way, these are also posted on our Facebook page if you want a different way to get those. So there's several ways to get these verses of the day and all this stuff that we try to provide and bring into your lives so that you can be part of our contemplation of the Scriptures. March 11th, Jesus said, "I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd gives up his life for his sheep." Now, this is a startling statement. There are definitely very good shepherds that will risk themselves. David himself, by his own report anyways, and I think we could trust him, has killed lions and bears who were trying to attack their sheep, and certainly one of the duties of the shepherd is to protect the sheep, and the more